The story of the English soldiers in France after the Hundred Years' War is one of displacement, resentment, and the challenges faced by former occupying forces in a land they once dominated. The Hundred Years' War, a series of conflicts between England and France from 1337 to 1453, left deep scars on both nations. After the war ended, the English crown lost nearly all of its French territories except for the port city of Calais. English soldiers, many of whom had settled in France during the war, found themselves increasingly unwelcome in the land they had once fought to control. During the Hundred Years' War, thousands of English soldiers were stationed in France, particularly in regions like Normandy, Aquitaine, and Brittany. Many of these soldiers had spent years in France, either as part of military garrisons or in service to English nobility who controlled vast swathes of land. Some soldiers settled permanently, marrying local women and setting up farms or small businesses. These English soldiers and settlers saw France as their new home, especially during the height of English control. However, their presence was not universally accepted. The war had brought widespread destruction to many parts of France, and the local population, particularly peasants, suffered greatly under English rule. Heavy taxation, forced conscription, and the general hardships of war left many French citizens resentful of the English occupiers. Even after the war, this resentment persisted, especially as England's grip on its French territories weakened. The conclusion of the Hundred Years' War came with France's decisive victory at the Po Battle of Castillon in 1453, leading to the collapse of English control over most of its French territories. French forces under the leadership of Charles VII successfully reclaimed lands previously held by the English, and with the war over, the political and social landscape of France began to shift. English soldiers who had lived in France for years were now seen as remnants of a hated occupation. The French peasants, who had long endured the presence of English forces in their lands, were eager to see them gone. With the war's end, the French crown sought to consolidate its power and national identity, leaving little room for the English settlers who had lived there. In the years following the war, many English soldiers were driven out of their homes in France. French peasants, emboldened by the restoration of French rule, often took it upon themselves to force the English out. This process was not always organized or overseen by the French government. In many cases, it was local French communities that carried out acts of hostility, raiding English settlements, destroying property, and threatening violence against those who refused to leave. The English soldiers and their families, once part of the occupying force, were now seen as enemies within. They faced economic ruin, social ostracism, and often violence. Many were left with no choice but to return to England, where they struggled to reintegrate into a society that had little use for former soldiers who had long lived abroad. Some found work as mercenaries, while others tried to resume civilian lives in a country that had changed during their absence. For those who remained in France, life was difficult. They were often treated with suspicion, viewed as collaborators with the former English rulers, and faced legal and economic disadvantages. Many of them lost their lands and homes to the French nobility or were forced into impoverished conditions as they were unable to find protection or support from the new French authorities. Much of the hostility faced by these English soldiers can be traced to the long-standing resentment harbored by the French peasantry. During the war, English forces had often raided French villages for supplies, imposed taxes, and conscripted locals into military service. The chevauchée, a military tactic used by the English that involved widespread pillaging of the French countryside, left lasting scars on many rural communities. These actions created deep-rooted animosity toward the English, even among the lower classes who might have had little direct interaction with English soldiers. After the war, as French peasants regained a sense of national pride, they saw the remaining English settlers as symbols of their past suffering. The expulsions of these soldiers were not merely about political loyalty, but were fueled by memories of the hardships endured under English occupation. The forced removal of English soldiers and settlers from France had lasting impacts on both countries. In England, the returning soldiers faced difficult transitions as the country shifted away from its imperial ambitions on the continent. Many veterans found themselves unemployed or struggling to reintegrate into English society. The expulsion also marked the end of England's long-standing presence in France, effectively ending the country's hopes of ruling French lands. In France, the expulsions contributed to the consolidation of national identity under the French crown. The removal of English settlers allowed the French monarchy to reassert control over its territories and rebuild the country after decades of war. However, the legacy of the English occupation and the violence that accompanied their departure left lingering tensions between England and France that would continue to shape their relationship for centuries. The story of the English soldiers in France after the 100 Years' War is a poignant reminder of the personal and social consequences of military conflict. For the English soldiers who had made lives in France, the end of the war meant loss, displacement, and exile. Driven out by resentful peasants and a resurgent French state, these former occupiers became victims of the very forces they had once served. Their experiences reflect the broader struggles of veterans and settlers in the aftermath of war, as shifting political tides leave them stranded between two worlds.